before the 14th of April, by my reckoning, it had been more than 4 years since the RBNZ last cut the OCR. So the CPI is now at 3.3%. Both Treasury and the Reserve Bank expect it to be back within the target band before too long. As we heard from the Finance Minister earlier this morning, the government is pledging a restrained fiscal approach and trying to promote greater growth. So to give us a detailed sense of where our economy is at and our prospects for sustainable growth over the medium term, please welcome our all-star panel of chief economists. All right, I will introduce each of our each of our economists and throw a very simple question to them. The question is, on a scale of to woo, where are we at? And we will start with the chief economist for ASB, Nick Tuffley.
We go.
Get close to the mic, Nick. Nick.
So I think we're still at the, bottom dwelling in many ways, but I think it's been pretty amazing to see how much of a mood shift there's been. It started coming through in July, and certainly since the Reserve Bank actually cut the OCR, there's quite a lot of happiness, although I'd note there are one or two people who deposit money who are less happy.
Yeah. Mary Jo Vergara.
Yeah, I'll answer it in two ways. If we're thinking about right here, right now, it's definitely and eye rolling, everything like that, hiding under tunnel vision. But if we're thinking about the future, it's very much on the other end of that scale. We're very happy with how we're pretty optimistic about how the next year will pan out in the years further from that. So it's really just the two things.
Very good. And ANZ economist Henry Russell, kia ora.
Thank you for the promotion as well, Jack.
Yeah, Sharon Zollner's going to be texting me after this, very upset.
I would say things are pretty tough out there at the moment. I've just been on the road last week, and despite the optimism that we've seen following the RBNZ decision, things are really tough out there still, and that's not going to change, I don't think, until probably the turn of the year, if not a little bit later. But without wanting to spoil the party, the job is actually not done just yet. And look, this cycle has been unique in the sense that it has been a policy-induced slowdown. There's been no external confidence or income shock. It's been a slow grind lower, and as we saw in ANZ's business and consumer confidence surveys last week, things have picked up pretty dramatically. Business confidence is at the highest level in a decade. There is a risk there that flows through into demand and potentially sees inflation stabilise before the job is done. So, look, we're not quite out of the woods yet.
Okay, just talk to us about that a bit more. How significant is that risk, do you think?
I think when you look at the broader economy and where things are sitting currently, there is ample spare capacity across the economy that would suggest that inflation is getting back to 2% and enough has been done. That being said, if things were to pick up, and one place to watch very closely over the coming months is going to be the housing market. If we do see the housing market take off and that confidence flows through into more spending, there is a risk that we see inflation pressures come back on. When you think about the cost pressures facing businesses, they haven't gone away. I heard an anecdote last week that shipping costs for some New Zealand firms are actually higher than they were during the peak of the COVID surge when they increased ninefold. So potentially, some of these businesses out there who are absolutely struggling, margins are being squeezed by weak demand. If demand does start to come back, there is a risk that, businesses look to make up some of that those losses and pass those costs on, and certainly there's been a hint of that in recent surveys, particularly our Business Outlook survey. Pricing intentions actually ticked up a touch in the last month. So look, the risk is there, but as things stand currently, I'd say there is enough spare capacity. Inflation is going to get back to 2%. The important question is not whether we get back to 2%, it's what the Reserve Bank needs to do to get us there.
Okay.
And there is a risk that they might have to take a few pauses on the way down.
Okay, we'll unpack that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. And by the way, don't forget, if you've got questions for our economists, you can submit those and I'll get to those questions in a little bit. Mary Jo and Nick, how quickly do you think we are going to see the impacts of those OCR cuts throughout the broader economy, or are we already seeing them?
I think it'll be quite quick this time around. That monetary policy transmission could be quite quick, because looking at the residential mortgage book, everyone's positioning for in the shorter terms. I think something like 70% of the mortgage book is either on floating or fixed for less than a year. So the rate cuts that we're expecting, that we're seeing, and more to come, should actually hit households and businesses quite soon, which will be a big relief. We've had an aggressive rate hiking cycle, the fastest rise in the cash rate in its history. So this rate relief will be much welcomed. And just looking at the mortgage book, that transmission could be quite quick this time around.
There is a lag though, right? Because people are fixed for however long, and presumably on the way up they're fixed for longer than they're likely to on the way down. Although maybe that's just me. Me guessing, if people have fixed for longer on the way up than on the way down, there is inevitably going to be a lag until the full weight of those cuts is experienced.
Yeah, there will be, although when we go through and do some calculations and look at, what's the average mortgage rate being paid at the moment, it does look like it is peaking about now. So we're now getting that balance between, yes, there are people who are on 3-something or 4-something, and there are probably a few 2-something people out there, and lucky you if you're one of those riding that one. But we're also getting that wave now where a lot of the fixed-term mortgage rates, particularly the ones that people are choosing, they're the lowest they've been since late 2022. So you're also getting a group of people who, fixed for, say, 18 months or so, or may have fixed a couple of years ago, and they are going to be rolling off and finding they're on a lower rate. So it's starting to balance out. So we're going to get this gradual impact on household or borrowers' cash flows where, bit by bit, the amount of income going into debt servicing is declining, and that's going to give those freer cash flows for people to then either spend a bit more on the smashed avocado on toast that you're not really supposed to be having if you want to borrow any money, for one, or do they just hold on to that and maybe pay down a bit of debt? So we don't know quite yet how households will react as their finances improve. There's another bucket of people, which is and this is where the housing market's also quite important. We've got a lot of people who have been sitting around just waiting for the right opportunity. They've got the means to do something, but they've just been waiting because it's looked like, the light at the end of the tunnel has actually just been a fast-moving train coming towards them. And now opportunity has arrived. So that's where I think we will see some initial people who go out and we start seeing evidence of that over the next few months of people taking action. And the housing market's a good barometer because where rates are now is what's mattering to the people who are looking at buying now, and we should see some activity start to come back in that relatively quickly.
Yeah. What about the labour market? I think unemployment's at 4.3, 4.6, 4.6. I mean, both RBNZ and Treasury are expecting that to spike in the first couple of quarters of next year. So there is, for a portion of working age population, there still is a lot of pain to come. What do you see the impact of that as being, Henry?
It's labour market lags the broader economy, so deteriorating labour market conditions are going to be a theme well into next year, even as potentially the economy starts to recover. If you look at the breakdown of jobs growth at the moment, filled jobs growth, that is, 3 sectors or 3 industries are contributing all of the strength: education, healthcare, and public administration and safety. These 3 industries are ones that are not particularly sensitive to monetary policy, but rather fiscal policy settings. And so outside of those 3 industries, the rest of the economy, employment in those sectors is already declining. And momentum is definitely continuing to head south. But with the change in government and, as has been, widely reported, the reduction in public sector employment, there is a risk that labour market conditions do start to deteriorate more rapidly from here as those public sector job cuts actually hit the data. So certainly on our forecast, we see unemployment rising to 5.5% at the end of next year. So that is going to continue to weigh on households' confidence, even as interest rate relief starts to flow through.
That's significant. I mean, basically a full percentage point if that forecast holds true, right? I mean, that is something I wonder if many New Zealanders haven't quite reckoned with the full weight and impact of that. Nick, what are you seeing?
Yeah, look, I think We're expecting so roughly around about 5.5%, sort of potentially by the middle of next year. I think there's probably some important things to break down. Is within that, we're expecting overall employment's going to be relatively flat. So you're getting sectors where you are getting the jobs growth, you're getting some where there's the declines. But one of the big drivers is that we've got basically a stagnant hiring market, but we've still got a fair degree of population growth. So that's been one of the things that's been, even over the last year, we've still seen a marginal increase in employment overall. And the big thing that's driven the unemployment up is we've just got so many more people, whether they're coming out of school, out of university, and in particular coming into the country and then finding that they can't get work. And that's probably one of the dynamics in there. What I think is interesting from a bank's perspective is what we've seen is that the people who are getting into financial difficulties is the people who are getting into it because of high interest rates. Looks like that's starting to ease back a bit, and the concern will be those people who lose their job, and then they're in quite a lot of difficulty very quickly. And it comes down to how quickly can you get your job back, which in places like Wellington will be a lot more difficult when you've got such a concentration of similar jobs going.
Yeah, that's a good point though. Mary Jo, if Kiwis, provided they don't lose their job in the next 12 months, if Kiwis have survived up until this point, are they good?
I think it's very industry specific. It depends on where exactly you are. Construction we know is doing very badly, and retail is on the down as well. So if you're in those sort of sectors, it is quite a tough time. Construction costs have eased back, but they're still, if you're talking about pre-pandemic levels, they're still very elevated. So it is very industry specific. We're expecting a pretty soft labour market, like Henry and Nick. We're seeing unemployment rise to about 5.5%. And that is the reason why we're expecting inflation to fall quite meaningfully. We know there's some stickiness in non-tradables, but in that domestic inflation picture, but with a deteriorating labour market, mostly driven by weakness in employment, that should see inflation, more return to the 2% target, more sustainably.
Can you guys talk to us a bit more about the migration dynamic? Because it occurs to me that over successive governments, arguably New Zealand has relied on pumping migration numbers to the benefit of GDP, whilst GDP per capita doesn't necessarily improve at anything like the same rate, while not building the schools and hospitals and infrastructure that is required to sustain those numbers of people. I was talking earlier about, we had experienced over 12 months, I think to the end of March, the highest net outward migration of New Zealand citizens over exactly the same period that we had record net inward migration. that is quite remarkable. To what extent do you think those migration figures have been pumping our economy in an unsustainable way? No?
I think you go back even before COVID, we had that period from 2016 right up until literally COVID hit, where we had very strong and quite sustained inbound migration. So over about a 3-4 year period, quite dramatic population increase, not with the same intensity we saw in the recent peak. I think the challenge for us is it's the sustainability of the flows, the predictability of them. You can open the door and people may not come in, or as we found out over the last couple of years, you open the door a little bit and all of a sudden you just get completely pummeled by the people charging through. So it can be very difficult to predict who's going to come in, and the government's got absolutely no control over who leaves. We have basically about 80,000 New Zealand citizens have left over the last year, and that number's probably going to keep on creeping up in terms of just the flow, and the government has absolutely no control over that. That's basically been driven by people's perceptions of what's the right thing for them to do. So challenge one is it's hard to control the flows. But I think challenge two is that we need to look hard at what does migration give to New Zealand? What do we want it to give? We've got factors to think about that we don't have all the skills that we need. We do need to work much harder at providing those skills internally. We have a lot of people who probably would be capable of working if we actually worked hard with them to get them more ready for work, but we're not always going to get all the skills. So that's sort of one part of it. The other aspect is we are an ageing population. So we had the speaker before talking about all the New Zealand people going over to Australia to look after the Australians over there, and then they just come over here for for a holiday. Well, look, we've got the issue that as we age, all of us are at some point going to end up in a retirement home, and we'll either have we're not quite as good as the Japanese. We all just keep on making a whole lot of robots that will do all the delicate tasks that we can't do any longer. But we're going to have those issues of how are we going to support an ageing population both financially and through the labour market. So look, migration, we're probably one of the few countries where we will probably benefit in that sense from net migration of people wanting to come here. But I think we need to have a conversation about what does migration mean for New Zealand, what do we want to get out of it, what are the implications of it, and how do we better prepare for it? Because as you say, we're woeful at the infrastructure. The council will authorise a housing development in one part of the city, won't think about, perhaps we need some roads that will go in there, forget about the schools. And all these decisions have been kind of quite detached from each other, and we need to have that more cohesive response, which I think we're starting to see a bit more in infrastructure and that long-term planning, which we do need to get right. So it's a very long-winded.
No, it's good. Yeah. I mean, the point is to start at the end point rather than and work back from there rather than be reactive, which I think arguably central government policy has been for quite some time. Mary Jo, you talked about the stickiness of non-tradables versus tradables at the moment. So what is driving that? Why is domestic inflation, as it's known, so much higher than international forces?
Yeah, the domestic inflation took longer to peak. So there are aspects of it that aren't as sensitive to interest rates, and that's currently what's driving it. So rental inflation is the highest it's been, running around 4.7%, obviously driven by the migration boom that we had. That's largely driven non-tradables higher. We've got council rates that have spiked as well. Insurance costs have spiked following last year's weather events. These components of domestic inflation aren't as sensitive to interest rate decisions and changes. So that's really the sticking point. Some of them are indexed to inflation as well, so it's going to take longer for that to flow through the inflation easing that we're seeing now. So that is what's keeping inflation quite elevated still, and has always been the difficulty in getting. We've beaten inflation from 7.2 to 3.3%, mostly off the back of imported costs easing quite rapidly with shipping costs. Yes, they have ticked up a little bit, but they're fallen. Oil prices have fallen, so that tradable inflation, rapid deterioration there, has driven inflation lower, but getting back from 3 to 2% hinges on taming that domestic inflation beast, and that's just going to take some time.
I came across a curious argument when it came to the different components of the CPI that suggested, and it might have just been a timely suggestion, but suggested carving out space for rental increases, rates increases, and insurance premium increases, because those three components were driving much of the elevated CPI that we'd experienced for some time. Is there any merit for something like that, especially in a changing climate, for example, where we know we've had decades of underinvestment and water infrastructure and that kind of thing likely to be driving some of those rates increases? The extreme weather events affecting insurance premiums, no doubt, for some time to come. Is there any argument to reconsider some of those different components?
I think it's pretty dangerous to start playing with the definitions of inflation first off the bat. Yes, I mean, the question is, can monetary policy today change the trajectory of insurance, council rates, etc. So 4 components, as Mary Jo mentioned. So you've got rents, council rates, insurance, and cigarettes and tobacco, actually. So they're, on our forecasts, are going to be contributing over half of all of non-tradable inflation in Q3. The thing about those 4 components is, so cigarettes and tobacco, the reason that's high is because of the excise tax component, which is indexed to past inflation. Insurance as well, cost of replacing goods for insurance companies has risen, same with councils for delivering goods and services. A lot of the pressure we're seeing in those components, yes, there's some structural factors, but it's the lagged response to past inflation as well. And so monetary policy settings today are not going to change that trajectory. And so in terms of what you mentioned about carving out space for these things, I think there's a little bit of a red herring in focusing solely on non-tradable inflation, because of these four things are outliers to a broader and generalised downtrend across the rest of the domestic inflation basket. But that said, if these things continue to, we see continued relative price gains in these areas, ultimately what that means for the Reserve Bank is they are going to have to put more downward pressure on the parts of inflation that they can influence, or in other words, keep interest rates higher for longer. So, where we sit today, yes, there's an argument to kind of look through that strength and focus on broader core inflation measures, stripping out some of these, outliers bucking the trend. But if they continue further down the line, that is going to produce challenges. Those things feed into inflation expectations after all in the long run.
Could each of you reflect on the impact of fiscal policy over the last 11 months and perhaps going forward? The Finance Minister, once again, telling us this morning she's planning to stick to her operating budget for next year. No?
Yeah, I think when you look at fiscal, you have to look back over the last few years, and it sort of reminds me, and apologies for my age, like a sort of old Hardy Boys sort of mystery, the mystery of the missing millions, which has got a nice ring about it, but it should be billions, really. And I think we're just there's a bit of a sort of wonder. We've been through a period where government spending as a share of the economy, of nominal GDP, has lifted quite sharply and remained high, and that's moving beyond all the temporary sort of COVID measures that we took. So we do have that genuine challenge of trying to get the spending and the revenue to switch around so that we're actually generating more revenue than we are spending. And obviously you can do that by raising taxes, which I don't think we'll see happening under this government, apart from things like the excise taxes and the like. And that focus is coming on the spending. We're probably, I think there is a case to be had for looking hard at the value for money we're getting out of the spending, because there's only so much money to go around, and the better the value you get out of every dollar that you spend, the better off our welfare is. I think the challenge that the current government has is that it is making these commitments to meeting these sort of operating balance targets, but yet relatively little time to figure out what's the valueless fat that you can cut out versus what's the actual really productive stuff, which is really important to do. And that's the challenge in, I think, trying to make cuts in a period of time. But the government does have a lot of luxury in the sense of we have got to get back to being able to run on a sort of, over the course of a cycle, some reasonably balanced budgets, and we are starting an rapidly ageing population period with a heck of a lot more debt than what we had 5 years ago, and that makes it much more difficult to deal with all the trade-offs we have to in the future. Do we raise taxes? Do we cut back superannuation? Do we, cut back on the healthcare costs that the public sector will need to pay? We'll get to a point where we have to start really steering into those sorts of choices.
Mary Jo, how do you reflect on the impacts of fiscal policy over the last 12 months and likely impacts going forward?
Yeah, going back even further than 12 months, I think we just saw how potent the mix fiscal policy and monetary policy was during COVID. We had very limited history in where they would work together. You had the GFC, but that was mostly a monetary policy response. Obviously, deploying fiscal policy during a health crisis is much more palatable. So we did see how strong targeted fiscal policy can be, and that should be the biggest learning really coming out of COVID. Budget 2024 was an interesting one. There was a temptation to spend more because we had just come out of a recession, so they did show some restraint in that respect. It was a bit of a disappointment to see that their infrastructure spending is on a downtrend over their forecast period. We obviously know how much this country needs infrastructure, and the reason why it had an uplift in the projections is mostly because of inflation pushing up those costs. So actually, if you adjust for that, we're not spending as much as necessary and as needed for infrastructure. So that was one disappointment. Their fiscal outlook, it was very small to see a surplus way out into the forecast. That's potentially going to be pushed out once again. It's 1.2, 1.3 billion, 0.3% GDP. That's basically a rounding error. So you could see that pushed out in the forecast period.
Yes. Again, successive governments have been known to push out that forecast. How have you reflected on the impact of fiscal policy and the likely path going forward, Henry?
I'll focus on the path forward because it's not just inflation that's telling us we're out of balance. We've got a pretty severe external imbalance as well with the current account deficit, and part of that reflects fiscal policy settings over the past few years. The challenge for this government is navigating a path, this fiscal consolidation path against a fairly weak economy, and so there is the path that they're taking. We are actually still running structural fiscal deficits over the entire forecast period. Despite the cuts that's been made by this government, government spending as a share of GDP does not return to the level that prevailed pre-COVID. So there is definitely more that could be unwound, and ultimately in the long run that is going to prove necessary. When you think about what's happened over the past several years, we've had a series of shocks, and fiscal policy has played a significant role in responding to those shocks, but that requires a strong fiscal position to be able to do that in the future. Then on top of that, you've got climate change, ageing population, infrastructure challenges, but you don't want to the government obviously doesn't want to pump the brakes too hard given how the economy is sitting. So it's a balancing act, but there is definitely in the long run more to do, I would say.
Are there standout international risks that are cause for concern at the moment, besides from November's election? Oh, we'll get to that. Yeah, I mean, to what extent is that a risk now?
Oh, well, it certainly got a little bit more exciting. It's made it harder to come up with jokes because it was great to be able to joke about the, diversity of opportunity in the States, particularly for elderly people just being able to keep on working on and on. It was setting a great example for an ageing population, I thought. But look, yes, we do have probably a lot of excitement around the US election. Probably the way to put it there is look, probably the main changes are if Donald Trump gets back in, the US budget deficits are going to be a lot larger. They're going to get a lot larger anyway because everybody's just spending a truckload of money that they don't have. It's just that if you have a full Democrat line up through the White House and the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're likely to also have the ability to raise taxes to pay for some of their spending. It's the impact on global relations, I think, is probably the worrying thing, is that Donald Trump's probably going to give Europe a much harder time and Russia a much easier time, which means that Ukraine's not left in a great space. It's just sort of rewarding dictators and autocratic governments in a sense with that. Relations with China probably get more difficult, but they're not going to get any easier, I think, anyway. There'll be a difference in the Middle East where I think you have on the Democrat side, they're a bit sort of more worried about some of the support base, which is a little bit more sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, whereas Donald Trump would probably be a lot more supportive of Israel, so there'd be some differences coming through there. But look, I think you've got a lot of these sort of geopolitical tensions around. We've basically got three different parts of the world where two where you've got outright wars happening and one where you've got quite a lot of political tension happening there. But look, things have been going okay. We've got lots of banana skins around, but I mean, apart from the risk of nuclear Armageddon and all the rest of it, and that,
if you can just put that to one side for a moment.
I'll, take a sort of brighter sense and say, look, globally inflation is getting under control. We're seeing central banks cutting interest rates. Federal Reserve should be cutting interest rates this month, Reserve Bank of Australia, possibly by the end of this year or early next year. And the global economy will be coming through on an upswing and be a little bit less fragile. But you just got this ongoing risk background, and I think we're getting used to it in some degree. The world just keeps on going on. It'll be the sort of like, I guess, if I'm taking the glass half full view, of that global situation.
What do you think about Trump has pledged some extraordinary trade tariffs if he's elected to the White House once again. Obviously, we would hope New Zealand exporters wouldn't be too impacted by that relative to Chinese exporters. But what would be the impact of that level of protectionism, do you think?
I think that what we're seeing, there's a couple of things going on, is that you're seeing some pretty extreme tariffs being put in place against China over selected things, and that's sort of part of, I guess, like a technology war that's going on between
the EV stuff is amazing, isn't it?
But Canada's followed as well.
Yeah, 100%, right?
So you're seeing that. So you're getting that part coming in, which probably means getting more product directed to markets like ourselves where we're more benign. So we're likely to find that there's quite a lot of cheap sort of Chinese sort of new energy technology coming our way. The wider tariffs that Donald Trump's talking about, 10% on literally anything that goes into the US. I suppose the two things with that, 10% in the grand scheme of things is not too big. It wouldn't set us at a disadvantage to other potential suppliers to the US, but it is sort of pitting that US versus everywhere else, and it's sort of tilting the scale a bit more towards US domestic producers, and that will be our challenges is for the stuff that we send to the US, like let's say beef that's going into McDonald's hamburger patties. To what extent do we start to see the prices that we get paid for that impacted, or the volume impacted, for example? But it's kind of a weird thing where it's broad based across everybody, friend or foe, but also at the same time relatively low. So it's not quite that draconian, and it doesn't offset put us at a disadvantage to other people. But it's just a reinforcement that just this whole sort of open global economy, and it's hard to wind back globalisation. We've been doing it for thousands of years, but it's just another example of the sort of us versus them, breaking the world down into blocks where you're competing more overtly rather than the sort of environment of cooperation that we have.
But it's not just Trump though, right? I mean, this is the thing. I mean, Biden continued much of the so-called trade war with China as well. So certainly for some of those major economies, we are kind of seeing more protectionist policies becoming the norm rather than a mere trend.
We certainly are, and I think the thing is it's organisations like the World Trade Organisation where the US is holding up appointments to the sort of board where, that deals with trade disputes, so even getting rulings over trade disputes and stuff like that's getting undermined. The UN's getting undermined, although it's sort of turning into a bit of a pointless, toothless thing when there's actually any conflict, because Russia's not sanctioning itself in the UN Security Council, for example. So you're getting this sort of fracturing of a lot of those bodies coming through, which is the challenge. You end up having sort of blocks of sort of like frenemy. We're starting to become blocks of friendly like countries trading with other blocks where, to an extent, and it's sort of getting that fracturing, and it's not good for the efficiency of getting goods around. Like proper free trade is a great thing where we do what really, really good at, sell it to you, you give us. Sell us, not give, what you're really good at, and it's sort of really efficient, and we're just putting up more and more blocks in the way, and that means higher costs, less efficient trade, less, welfare gains for us globally.
Okay, I'm going to throw each of you a couple of quick sort of forecast questions, and then we'll take some questions from the floor because there are heaps of great questions coming through. Henry, you touched on it before, but just talk to us about the balance you think the RBNZ needs to strike throughout this path as they continue to cut the OCR, and the risks that you see as being present if inflation turns out to be a bit stickier than we thought.
I should probably add that is one side of the risks, and there's also the other side that, the economy is on the verge of a deep slowdown and inflation pressures fall much faster. If you think back to what happened in August with the RBNZ's decision, or between May and August and the significant change in their forecasts, so GDP, labour market and inflation data all very close to forecast, but it was the high frequency indicators that suggested the economy was experiencing a significant slowdown that caused them to act and to cut. What we've seen since then has been almost all of those indicators have rebounded in July, and some of them quite sharply. And so that is not to say that the economy is recovering, by the way, but it does suggest that some of the weakness that was, evident in the data in June was overstated, and there was a risk that we saw at the time going into August that, exactly this outcome would happen. That the sharp deterioration in the data we saw in June was a knee-jerk reaction to the Reserve Bank's May meeting when they said that rate cuts were not going to happen until August 2025. And so, look, the risk now is that, we're all closely watching these high-frequency data, but they are going to be jumping all over the place. They're volatile at the end of the day. And so, the Reserve Bank needs to make sure that it's not being reactionary to these very volatile data and just be patient in some respects. I think it's a pretty sure bet that the Reserve Bank's going to deliver the next 2 or 3 cuts, right? 25 in October, November, and February. But then things are going to get, it's a bit more uncertain out then. We'll have a better sense of how the economy is kind of responding to lower interest rates, and we'll have a better sense of how weak the economy was through the second half of this year. So, kind of all bets are off when you think about 2025, and I would just say that monetary policy is not on a preset course from here. There is absolutely risk both ways.
Mary Jo, how do you reflect on that? What do you see as being the path of the cash rate?
Well, down. We're expecting more easing to come. Yes, the high frequency data had really pushed them, but I think what pushed them over the edge in that August meeting was inflation expectations. They flatlined. They're flat as a pancake. 2 year ahead, that's back at 2. Further out is back at 2 as well. So yes, we may have some shocks, but so long as they can anchor those inflation expectations, and you don't want the risk of it falling below 2% and undershooting their target. So we think they'll actually continue cutting. We see the cash rate at 4.75. I think that's more of a done deal. There's a lot of risk around the labour market being softer than expected. So unlike other central banks which meet more frequently, we don't have a pause in our cash rate trajectory.
Yeah. Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for us, we're sort of more on the side of the risks, slightly skewed towards inflation easing a little bit quicker, or the economy just not picking up quite quick enough to, mean that you don't worry about inflation falling too far. So we're on the side of, if there's any sort of risk, it's going to be not so much that inflation ends up going back to being sticky and slow and falling. It's probably more the risk that, the impact of past tightening means that inflation perhaps falls a bit quicker than expected. Having said that, look, financial markets are well ahead. They've got, basically 70 basis points of easing price in by the end of the year. That's over the next 2 meetings. They've got over 100 priced in over the next 3 meetings through to February. That's looking like it's already baking in an expectation that news is going to be a lot weaker than what the Reserve Bank's been expecting. And the Reserve Bank set quite a high bar for that. They're expecting a 0.5% decline in the GDP figures, which are yet to come out for the June quarter. They're expecting inflation is going to fall quite markedly as well. So they're already factoring in quite a lot of bad news. So we think it's a case of steady 25 basis point cuts from here. It's a very, I think, as Henry said, pretty clear cut that they're going to be cutting easily at the next few meetings, and we do expect that they'll keep going steadily. Now, the risk is maybe they need to step it up a bit, but we think the market's probably overcooked that. Does mean it's been a great environment for people to go out and hedge because there's been so much built into for interest rate declines over the next year as well.
Housing market, where do you see it going? Medium term?
We're still not building enough houses at the end of the day. So if you think about the long run trend of the New Zealand housing market or in house prices, our housing deficit is continuing to widen again. We let in a truckload of people. Over the past few years, that's now changing, but high interest rates have weighed heavily on construction activity. So that long run trend is likely to persist, but in terms of the near-term outlook, momentum in the housing market is southbound currently. Sales activity has been pretty subdued and listings are on the rise. They're the highest in a decade. Suggests there is a backlog to clear, which is likely going to take a lower price, at least in the near term. But now that interest rates are falling, it's pretty uncertain how quickly things return. The housing market makes fools out of economists all the time in New Zealand. So, our forecast is, 2025 we'll probably see 4.5% growth in house prices, and house prices will probably stabilise around the end of this year. But I'd be very surprised if that forecast comes true. I should say it's a balance of risks. On one side of it, things pick up pretty quickly. We see a return of fear of missing out, or animal spirits captivate the market. But on the other side, if the economy is experiencing a deeper slowdown, the labour markets, deteriorates, and et cetera, then we might be looking at a more gradual recovery.
Any other economists want to be fools on that one?
Well, I probably should point out that we had absolutely the best house price forecast in 2020 when the pandemic hit, because we were only forecasting a 6% decline in house prices, and we only got the sign wrong and the magnitude wrong by about 4, which was generally better than most people. Look, we're of the view that it'll be pretty flat the rest of this year. We're already seeing through realestate.co.nz that they're reporting a lot more buyer interest coming through in terms of hitting their site and viewing listings. So I think we'll start to see sales turnover picking up over the next few months. As Henry said, the number of listings has been pretty high. There's some early signs maybe it's starting to flatten off, but in the short term there's a lot of stock on the market, and we need to see that stock getting eaten into for sustained price increases to come through. Having said that, at fear of getting the sign wrong and the magnitude wrong again, we're expecting somewhere around about a 10% increase in prices next year. So we do see lower interest rates boosting demand. Population growth, yes, it is slowing, but we're still going to have that need for more people coming through over time. We'll start to see developers eyeing up getting projects underway, but that can still take 12 plus months before those actually sort of literally hit the market.
We're fast running out of time, but some great questions from the floor that I want to put to the panel. Has the sustained period of high inflation outside of the Reserve Bank target affected the credibility of RBNZ going forward, and specifically the Monetary Policy Committee and their ability to get back to target inflation and maintain it in light of potential future shocks?
I think it got close to, with those inflation expectations really running away from that 2% target, but we just have to understand that the run-up in inflation was largely driven by offshore factors, and we now see inflation expectations back at 2%, so that keeps their credibility in check, something they're very protective over, obviously being the first bank to introduce inflation targeting. So they're back in the band, and we're now in the easing cycle. So there was a time where we did question, maybe they have to do even more to rein in those expectations, but we're now at expectations of 2%, even further out, back at 2% as well. So I think for now, we just know that the next time we see inflation expectations run, you just have to keep hiking. But yeah, I think they're in check for now.
Next thoughts?
Yeah, I think there was, it's been a challenging time for the Reserve Bank and its reputation with inflation getting so high. Not the only one dealing with that. Now, I do think the Reserve Bank missed some signs late 2020, early 2021, particularly around the housing market, where it was clear that was just going absolutely ballistic, and it wasn't just people making up for, the lockdowns and the lack of ability to buy homes. They probably pushed a little bit too hard dogmatically at the threat of setting the OCR at a negative rate and factors like that. Probably held on too long there. But to give them some credit, they were pretty much the first developed economy central bank to get on and lift interest rates. And when they realised that inflation was looking very persistent, they weren't afraid to just step up and lift interest rates quite dramatically. So look, and that they've demonstrated, yes, they will do what it takes to get inflation back down, and they're nearly there. But there's a lot of central banks which are being looked at very hard. Reserve Bank of Australia committed to keeping interest rates basically at near zero until 2024 and had to renege on that, to huge amount of cost to households who took them at their word. And you've had a replacement of the Reserve Bank governor along the way after an inquiry as well. So reputation, you can lose it very quickly. It takes a while to earn it.
This is a great question that I know will be of interest to many in the room. Do you see the Reserve Bank ever having different levers to manage the economic environment in addition to OCR rate reviews? For example, could we not up mandatory KiwiSaver contributions as a way of reducing household spending and taking demand out of the economy? Henry?
There is an argument that that's a little bit draconian, right? And forcing people to do something essentially, whereas, interest rates, people can choose whether that affects them or not, depending on whether they, how they invest, whether they have debt, etc., etc. So, look, interest rates are used, around the world, or monetary policy rates rather, are used around the world for the reason that they are probably the most effective tool. That's not to say there aren't other tools, but yeah, I wouldn't kind of suggest that we throw away the tool given what's happened over the past few years. It's been a fairly, unique cycle. But at the end of the day, inflation is falling all across across the world. Central banks are easing interest rates. And so, yeah.
Reflecting on COVID and the post-COVID period, what is the one thing from an economic view we, i.e. New Zealand, must never do again in the event of a future similar event?
Well, that's a tricky one, because I think a lot of the government responses we saw in 2020 were, the right thing to do at the time, in the sense that none of us had any idea what was going to really happen when you tell everybody to go and sit at home and work if you can. We had the Treasury forecasting 12% unemployment. That's a pretty horrifying outcome when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs. I think the one thing we need to bear in mind is that, look, we saved a lot of lives through what we did, and it happened globally, but the actual cost of saving those lives has been enormous in many ways, whether it's the financial cost to the government, which we're going to be paying for generations, whether it's the impact on people's mental health of being locked up for ages, the impact on education that we had, the impact on health, where you had so much healthcare delayed, cancelled, people missing out on cancer treatment and other things like that, where you've got all these hidden costs. And I think we really, when looking at it from a very pure, dispassionate economist point of view, it's that whole cost-benefit. We focus very much on a lot of the benefits and very narrow ones. And it has been quite a traumatic thing around the world. Like, we've all done similar things. We've all responded to a huge fear of dying in a new and uncertain way, as you do to risks you're not familiar with, by perhaps reacting very strongly to it. So I think we'd need to think, it's balancing up, what can we do? What should we do? Trying to understand a bit better the implications, because it's been not just here, but globally, the response has left quite a lot of scarring, saved a lot of lives along the way, particularly compared to, say, the 1918, quote unquote Spanish flu, where people just went, well, we've just fought a war where we just sent people out to die, and millions by the day. So if they catch a small bug, it doesn't matter sort of approach. It's we've had a very different shift around in our value on life, which in many ways is a great thing. But sometimes we need to understand the costs of what we do.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that when we sit down together on these couches in 12 months' time, in terms of the to yay, we'll all be a lot closer to yay than we are right now. But thank you so much for your time and insights. Please join me in thanking the panel: Nick Tuffley, Mary Jo Vergara, and Henry Russell.